I would like to see families and those hard-working Australians and resident companies pay less tax, but the question is, can we afford it? The government says we can afford $140 billion of personal tax cuts and $60 billion of company tax cuts over a 10-year period, which means the cost to the revenue base is $20 billion a year, or 7% of the income tax base. The government has no plans to reduce wasteful spending, so how will the $20 billion shortfall in taxation income be made up? In the last financial year, high commodity prices, particularly for iron ore and coal, led to a surprise increase of 22.5% in company income tax receipts. The government says these additional taxes are sustainable income in long term, even though commodity prices go through a boom and bust cycle. The government has made a large number of assumptions about future income, which in my view are not realistic, and a never-ending commodity boom is but one of them. So I come back to whether the tax cuts proposed by the government, both personal and corporate, are affordable. If they prove not to be affordable, then we will see a dramatic decline in frontline services or an increased national debt. It is no accident that in an election year the government wants to rain money down on citizens in the form of tax cuts. There are 5 by-elections coming up in July and a general election in the next 12 months. In stage 1 of the proposed personal tax cuts, the government promises $10 a week in the form of a tax offset. Labor says $10 a week is an insult. They will up the bid for your vote, to nearly $20 a week, but these tax offsets end in 4 years. A by-election in the electorate of Longman in Queensland will take place in July. The citizens of Longman paid $784 million of income tax to the federal government in 2015-16. These taxpayers paid more in income tax than 80% of multinational companies and their Australian subsidiaries, but still the government says we do not have a revenue hole created by multinationals not paying a fair share of tax. In the past 20 years, we have had both Labor and Liberal national government, and neither of them have had the wit nor the will to do anything to fill the revenue hole created by foreign-owned companies and their wholly owned subsidiaries. How can the government say there is not a revenue problem when 39 fossil fuel companies operating in Australia pay no tax, and they include our biggest electricity providers, Origin Energy and Energy Australia? The 2 major parties want to tell you they are different, but when it comes to getting multinational companies to pay tax in Australia, they are one. We estimate that the revenue hole left by non-resident foreign companies operating in Australia to be big enough to pay for the government's proposed tax cuts for individuals and companies. When we talk about getting multinationals to pay tax in Australia, Labor is like the scarecrow with no brains, and the Liberals like the Tin Man with no heart, walking down the yellow brick road in search of everything they lack, which is why so many voters give their vote to a minor party. Around 25% of votes are given to minor parties, which reflects the disconnect between what concerns Australians and the major parties. The majority of Australians do not want population growth driven by high levels of immigration, and they do not want to pay more tax than they should. The Big Four banks in Australia pay 25% more income tax than all the multinational companies and their subsidiaries operating in Australia. The biggest corporate taxpayers in Australia are banks and resource companies. The Commonwealth Bank paid $3.3 billion, followed by Westpac with $3 billion, NAB $2.4 billion and ANZ paid $2 billion. The highest amount of tax paid by a multinational was $386 million. How on earth can the government say there is no problem with the conduct of multinationals and their subsidiaries in Australia? If citizens want a more equitable and a fairer society, then multinationals have to pay their fair share of tax, and citizens need to communicate that at the ballot box when they cast their vote. A vote for the One Nation candidate in Longman is a vote for a change in dealing with multinationals who expect to pay nothing for all the things that allow them to operate profitably in Australia. Voters in every by-election need to tell politicians that being asleep at the wheel on multinational tax is not good enough, and the best way is to give your vote and your preferences to candidates who say they have a valuable plan. The average Longman taxpayer paid $12,000 in income tax in 2015-16, while 26% of multinational subsidiaries operating in Australia paid nothing. The list of 145 includes Chevron Australia Holdings, ExxonMobil Australia, Puma Energy, who operate petrol stations across Queensland, American Express and Vodafone Hutchinson Australia. There is not time to read out the full list because it is a long list. The length of the list of multinationals not paying tax in Australia should be a matter of shame to the government and the previous Labor government. I have been talking about non-resident companies failing to pay their tax for over 20 years. I am sick of hearing that the ATO has all the laws and staff it needs, because self-evidently that cannot be the case when fossil fuel companies pay more in political donations than they do in tax. I have been talking to the government about budget repairs since I became a senator. I have told the government at every opportunity that they need to get multinationals and their wholly owned subsidiaries to contribute to the income tax base. I have strongly advocated for reform of the gas taxation system, but the government is not interested. All I can do is make Australians aware of the facts and let them decide if it is an issue, which will help decide which candidate received their vote. One Nation's policy on multinational tax reform and reform of the gas taxation system is well documented. It is pleasing to hear now that Senator Di Natale, in his comments today about tax and multinationals not paying their taxes, he's clearly been listening to my comments in this chamber for the last 2 years, and he's now picked it up and running with it, the same as he did with the Australians building the rail line in Queensland to do with the Adani mine. So it's good to hear that you've actually been listening to me and taking up this case. I supported company tax cuts for businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million, but I will not support further tax cuts for businesses until the government acts to repair the budget through a new tax base from multinational companies. I find myself in a dilemma, Mr Acting President, over whether or not to support the government's personal income tax plan, which costs more than the extension to the company tax cut plan. I do not understand why the government is so reluctant to fund tax cuts with a new tax base created by getting multinationals and their wholly owned subsidiaries to pay their fair share of tax. I do not understand why the government's plan for personal income tax cuts is so complex. In Stage 1, the tax offsets of $520 ends in 4 years and then become a tax offset for those on very low incomes. In Stage 2, effected in 4 years' time, the threshold amounts in different brackets change. In Stage 3, effective in 6 years' time, one tax bracket disappears and the tax rates change. Once the second reading speech is finished, the Senate will go into committee to debate amendments made to this complex legislation. The government does not want to split the 3 stages of personal tax cuts, even though there is broad support for Stage 1 starting on 1 July 2018. Tomorrow, senators are asked to undertake a difficult process not dissimilar to comparing mobile telephone plans. The government's failure to split the bill into 3 stages creates a dilemma for me, because Stage 3 starts in 6 years' time, and no one can predict whether we will be able to afford tax cuts legislated now. My dilemma is that I know Australians are doing it tough. Wage growth is very low. Certain cost of living items are rising much faster than wages. People are struggling to pay electricity bills. They manage by going without adequate heating or cooling when needed. Electricity bills are the #1 cost of living concern for Australians, and that is a tragedy in a country rich in gas and coal. Labor has come to see me this week to seek support for their position, which is to support stage 1 of the personal tax cuts while increasing the tax offset. Labor tells me that stage 2 of the personal tax cut should not be supported because the threshold move will give those on $90,000 to $120,000 a windfall of $1,350, and later in stage 3 those on $200,000 will receive tax relief of up to $7,000. Do I need to remind Labor that tens of hundreds of electricians, plumbers, nurses, secondary school teachers, lift mechanics and welders earn more than $90,000 and will miss out on a permanent tax cut if Labor opposes stage 2 of the proposed personal income tax plan? These are your voters. These are people who are possibly just on a basic wage, then they get offered overtime to earn those few extra dollars, and yet you are denying those people you are supposed to support, the battlers, and they are the battlers. It's not a fortune that they're making. Let me also remind this House that the average backbench politician on $200,000 will receive an extra $4,000, but many will get much more because their salaries are much higher than $200,000. How can Labor and the Greens deny these tax cuts to hundreds of thousands of hard-working Australians on taxable incomes from $120,000 up to $200,000 when they have accepted pay rises in excess of 6% in recent times? Individuals will work in isolated and dangerous workplaces and are highly skilled, have taxable incomes much greater than $100,000, and they include 31,998 coal miners or mining technicians earned an average taxable income of $118,409. 2,706 plant operators earned an average taxable income of $136,985. 234 pressure welders earned an average taxable income of $107,210. I challenge Labor, who argue against tax cuts of $1,350 for those on $90,000 to $120,000 in 4 years' time, to reject their minimum wage increase of $4,000 a year from July 2018. Bill Shorten will pocket an increase of over $7,000 from the 1st of July 2018, but says those who work long hours do not deserve a tax cut of a similar amount. I challenge Labor to set an example and reject the 2% pay rise awarded by the Remuneration Tribunal last week. Knock back your pay rise. You don't want to give anyone.
Order.
Now, I was one—
Order.
Chair.
Order.
Instructing President. I was one of the 6 senators in March last year to vote against the pay rise under a budget surplus was delivered, until a budget surplus was delivered. For the record, all Labor senators and the Greens—
Senator Hanson, please resume your seat. I just urge the chamber— it's been a fairly diplomatic hour since I've been here, so I urge the chamber to come to order and allow the senator to present without disruption. Senator Hanson.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. I was one of the 6 senators in March last year to vote against the pay rise until the budget surplus was delivered. For the record, all Labor senators and the Greens and the Liberal National Party, they all voted for their pay rise in March 2017, and some of the crossbenchers. Remember, only 6 senators sat on this side who voted for a pay cut. But these same senators now say it is unaffordable for others to receive a modest tax cut. Hypocrites. The Australian Greens do not support any of the tax cuts because they feel every dollar is needed by the government
Hanson,
for—
please resume your seat. Senator, on a point of order.
The senator is reflecting on members of this chamber by calling us hypocrites. I would ask that she withdraw that.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hanson, just resume your seat until I rule on the point of order. The expressions in this chamber have been far-ranging. The senator didn't direct that to any person in particular, and I don't think there's a point of order. Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I've had to toughen up in this place. It's a shame others don't do the same. The Australian Greens do not support any of the tax cuts because they feel every dollar is needed by the government for refugees, the Safe Schools program, subsidies for unreliable energy sources and drive up electricity prices, and they want to dramatically lift the amount of money helping those in foreign countries. And Labor wants to double the foreign aid budget, but the Greens want to almost triple the foreign aid budget to $12.28 billion. They want to give foreign aid, Australia's taxpayers' dollars, to overseas countries. They're not worried about people, hard-working Australians, and give them a tax relief here in Australia, but they want the money to go overseas. $12.28 billion. That's to date. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, she's spoken of the bill, but unfortunately she had read it and she did not understand it. It's quite funny for Senator to actually make comments about me. She said that I'm getting a tax cut. No, I'm not. I'm on the same wage as Sarah Hanson-Young. The tax cuts are going to be up to $200,000. I'm a very, very fortunate Australian to be earning more than $200,000. I'm paying 45 cents in the dollar tax on that. I'm not getting tax relief. And to actually make that comment is misleading this parliament. Also, the fact is that I don't think she understands. If she's really worried about the pensioners and the battlers and everyone out there, then I suggest that she actually flies economy class like I do, instead of seeing her up the front of the plane. More cost to the taxpayers, or taking a child on a taxpayer-funded whale watch, or actually overseas trips. This is just so, what can I say? It makes the whole place a joke, that these people in here are actually, expecting Australians to actually not get a tax cut, and yet they go out there and want to, they don't want to take tax cuts themselves. The whole thing is what I've said here in my speech. Hard-working Australians need a helping hand. They need to know that they are going to get something back, that something's been done for them. They are sick and tired of seeing everyone else around this world getting relief. We give them foreign aid, everyone. People here are struggling to pay their own bills. And because of the Greens and the renewable energy that is sending up electricity prices, the cost of living, Australians cannot keep going at this rate. So my dilemma is, yes, we have a black hole. Are we going to actually fill that black hole? My proposal is go after the multinationals to pay their fair share of tax in this country. Look after the Australians, the hard-working families that need some relief and need a help in this country. Yes, suspend taxation, increase in politicians' wages and those of bureaucrats. How can you actually say to those hard-working Australians, you can't get a tax relief of even the highest amount is up to $7,000 a year, yet we are seeing bureaucrats receiving pay increases of up to $17,000 a year? That doesn't pass the pub test for the Australian people. It doesn't pass the pub test with me. And that's why my job in the Senate is to represent the Australian people to the best of my ability. I will make my vote clear on the floor of Parliament when it comes to vote, but I will listen to what all the amendments are going to be put up, and I will make a decision based on what I think is right for the Australian people. Thank you, Mr Acting President.
Thank you, Senator Hanson.